After switching over to the Famicom, there was a time when I wasn't happy with anything I was creating. I thought of retiring from the game industry, and I created Final Fantasy as my final project. That's why the title includes the word final. But for me, the title Final Fantasy reflects my emotional state at the time and the feeling that time had stopped. They say that technologically it's good to keep going, and each time we give it our all and expand our skills and energy until we can go no further. This is what I consider to be the Final Fantasy. This is a quote from the creator of the original Final Fantasy and his emotional state at the time he developed the game.
Dream is always the same. I'm standing, waiting for something. If they knew about these dreams, they'd shut me down. The question is, will I be in time to save the Earth? We found it.
Yes, the seventh spirit. You'll need to find the eighth and final spirit.
We're closing in on the life form.
It'll be one of those days.
Fantasy is a Japanese role-playing franchise developed and owned by Square Enix. The first installment was released in 1987 on the Nintendo Famicom. Subsequent games are numbered and given a story unrelated to previous games, so the numbers are volumes rather than sequels. Each game is generally a standalone story with different settings, plots, and main characters, but they are linked with several recurring elements, including gameplay mechanisms and structure with a group of heroes battling evil.
I'm not sure.
Quick disclaimer before I get started: all the games will be shown in their original release dates in Japan, and all the mobile games will be mentioned briefly at the end of the video. I'm not covering DLCs or add-ons to the games, but I'm going through all the main games in the series and the spin-off games. So anyway, without further ado, let's get on with it. Final Fantasy, the first game in the series, originally released for the family computer in 1987. Originally titled as Fighting Fantasy, but due to trademark and other circumstances, the name was changed. Final Fantasy was re-released several times. In 1987 on the Famicom, 1990 on the NES in North America, 1999 on the Sony MSX, 2000 on the WonderSwan Color, 2002 on the PlayStation 1, 2004 on the Game Boy Advance, 2007 on the PlayStation Portable, and 2014 on the Nintendo DS. The story follows the Light Warriors, who carry one of 4 elemental orbs that were darkened by evil forces. The goal is to restore light to the orbs and save the world. Final Fantasy II, the second game in the Final Fantasy series. This game was initially not released outside of Japan, but has received numerous remakes and enhancements throughout the years. First in the original release 1988 on the Famicom, 2001 on the WonderSwan Color, 2002 on the original PlayStation, 2004 on the Game Boy Advance, and 2007 on the PSP. The game story centers around 4 kids whose parents were killed during an army invasion. Final Fantasy II and Sid also eliminated the experience points and introduced an activity-based progression system. The Final Fantasy Legend, the first game in the Saga series released for the Game Boy in 1989, was also the first role-playing game released for the Game Boy. Not truly a Final Fantasy game. When it was translated into English for worldwide release, it was renamed, linking it to the Final Fantasy series to improve the marketing for the game. Several re-releases were done over the years. In 1989, the original release on the Game Boy. In 1998 on the Game Boy Color. In 2002 on the WonderSwan. The story follows 4 heroes who attempt to scale a tower at the center of the world that leads to paradise. This game became Square's first million-copy seller, with an estimated 1.37 million copies shipped worldwide. Final Fantasy III, released in 1994 for the Famicom. The game was re-released several times, including a cancelled version for the WonderSwan. The game's first release outside of Japan was on the DS in 2006, which sold nearly 2 million copies. Final Fantasy III, 1990 on the Famicom, 2006 on the Nintendo DS, 2012 on the PSP. Final Fantasy Legend II, the second game in the Saga series, released for the Game Boy in 1990. The game was again rebranded as a Final Fantasy title due to the popularity of the series. The game had a few re-releases and updates, including 1990 for the Game Boy, 1998 for the Game Boy Color, and 2009 for the Nintendo DS. The DS version featured a new soundtrack, 3D graphics, a new story, and a new soundtrack. Final Fantasy Adventure, also known as The Secret of Mana, originally released in Japan as Seiken Destined 2: The Legend of the Sacred Sword, as a spin-off of Final Fantasy and the first game in the Mana series. Published in 1991 with several re-releases, including 1998 for the Game Boy Color, 2003 the Game Boy Advance as Sword of Mana, 2016 on the Vita as Adventures of Mana. Gameplay is similar to The Legend of Zelda on the NES, but with RPG elements mixed in. Final Fantasy IV, also known as Final Fantasy II in North America, released in 1991 for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Fourth game in the main series, Final Fantasy IV introduced several innovations that became staples of Final Fantasy games and RPGs in general, such as character-driven plots, new technologies, active time battle system, and critically acclaimed soundtrack. The game had several re-releases and ports over the years, including 1997 on the PlayStation, 2002 on the WonderSwan Color, 2005 on the Game Boy Advance, 2007 on the DS, and 2011 on the PSP. The game was sold over 4 million copies worldwide and is considered one of the most influential RPGs of all time. Final Fantasy Legend III, the third game in the Saga series, was released in Japan December 1991 and North America August of 2003. In Final Fantasy Legend III, the player takes the role of three characters sent back in time to prevent a massive global flood from destroying the world. The releases include 1998 Game Boy Color and 2011 Nintendo DS release. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest was the first Final Fantasy game released first in North America before Japan. It was a spin-off of the Final Fantasy series. The game was designed to be a scaled-down, simplified RPG for those new to that style of gameplay. This included more action-adventure elements in previous games and was the first Final Fantasy game to be released in Europe. This only had the one release in 1992 and 93. Final Fantasy V, a medieval fantasy RPG that was originally released in Japan in 1992, was later ported to the Sony PlayStation in 1998 and released in North America in 1999, and was released in 2006 on the Game Boy Advance. The movie Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystal series is a sequel of events to the version of this game. The game sold over 2 million copies in Japan and over 350,000 copies on the PlayStation alone. Final Fantasy VI, also known as Final Fantasy III in North America, was released in 1994 and became the sixth game in the main Final Fantasy series. The game has several re-releases and ports, including 1999 on the PlayStation, 2002 on the PlayStation, and 2006 on the Game Boy Advance. SNES and PlayStation versions sold over 3.48 million copies worldwide and won several awards. Set in the world of a second industrial revolution, the game's story follows a cast of 14 playable characters in a real-to-life series drama with evil dictatorships, wars, and life events. Final Fantasy VII, the seventh game in the main Final Fantasy series, released in 1997 for the Sony PlayStation. Development originally began in 1994 for the Super Nintendo, but after delays and technical difficulties, Square decided to move to the PlayStation, largely due to the CD-ROM format. The game had a staff of over 100 people and a marketing budget of around $80 million US. Successes of the game led to several enhanced ports for the PlayStation 4 Digital Edition, 2019 Digital for the Switch and the Xbox One, and a long-awaited remake supposedly for the PS4. But at this rate, it could be a launch title for the PS5. Final Fantasy Tactics is a tactical RPG developed for the Sony PlayStation. It was the first game in the Final Fantasy Tactics series and was released in Japan in 1997 and then in the US in 1998. In contrast to other 32-bit Final Fantasy titles, Final Fantasy Tactics uses 3D isometric rotatable playing field with bitmap sprite characters. Final Fantasy Anthology is a North American compilation of Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy VI for the PlayStation, released in 1999. It included several graphical changes and bonus content. And then there was another re-release in 2006 on the Game Boy Advance. Final Fantasy VIII, released in 1999 for the Sony PlayStation. Development began in 1997 during the English localization of Final Fantasy VII. It was the first Final Fantasy to use realistic proportion characters, feature a vocal song as its theme music, and to forego the use of magic points for spell casting. It earned $50 million during its first 13 weeks of release, making it the fastest selling Final Fantasy game until Final Fantasy XIII. A Windows port was released in 2000 with the addition of the Chobo World minigame. The game has sold over 8.5 million copies worldwide. Final Fantasy IX, released in 2000, and was the last Final Fantasy game to debut on the regular PlayStation. The game was developed alongside Final Fantasy VII, envisioned as a retrospective for the series by departing from the futuristic setting of 7 and 8 and returning to the medieval style of the first 6 games. The re-releases include 2016 for Windows, iOS, and Android, 2017 for the PS4 Digital Edition, 2019 for the Switch and Xbox One. Final Fantasy Chronicles is a compilation of Final Fantasy IV and Chrono Trigger, released in 2001 for the original PlayStation. Several bonus features were added to each game, including art galleries, cutscenes, gamer-generated full-motion video, and enemy cut stories for Chrono Trigger. Final Fantasy X was originally released in 2001 for the PlayStation 2. The game marks a series transition from entirely pre-rendered backdrops to fully 3D areas, and also the first in the series to feature voice acting. Final Fantasy X began development in 1999 with a budget more than $32 million US and a team of over 100 people. Also the first game in the series to be a direct sequel. Final Fantasy X was re-released in 2013 for the PS3 and the Vita, 2015 for the PS4, 2016 for Windows, 2019 digital editions for the Switch and Xbox One. Final Fantasy XI, also known as Final Fantasy XI Online, is an MMORPG as part of the Final Fantasy series, released in 2002 for the PlayStation 2 and Microsoft Windows. This was the first game to offer cross-platform play and was the first MMORPG for the Xbox 360. All versions of the game require a monthly subscription to play. Since the game debuted, it has had 5 expansion packs and 6 add-on scenarios. The final active server was shut down in March of 2016. Final Fantasy Origins was a compilation of Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy II for the PlayStation. Released in Japan in 2002 as 2 separate games, and then again released as a combined package, Final Fantasy 1 and 2 Premium. It was released in the US in 2003. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance is a tactical RPG for the Game Boy Advance and was released in 2003. The game is a spin-off of the main series and shares several traits of the 1997 Final Fantasy Tactics for the original PlayStation, but is not a direct sequel. Final Fantasy X-2 was released in 2003 as a direct sequel to Final Fantasy X. It was the first game to feature only 3 playable characters, an all-female cast, and early access to most of the game locations. And it's one of the few games to feature multiple endings. It was the last game developed by Square before the merger with Enix. The game had several re-releases and remasters, including 2013 for the PS3 and Vita, 2015 for the PlayStation 4, 2016 for the PC, and 2019 digital version for Xbox One and Switch.
In position. It's showtime, girls.
Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles is a spin-off of the main Final Fantasy series, released in Japan in 2003 and North America in 2004. It was the first title released for a Nintendo console since Final Fantasy VI in 1994. The game went on to sell over 1 million copies worldwide. This brought in the Crystal Chronicles series for Nintendo systems, including 2007 Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Rings of Fate for the DS, 2008 Real World title Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles My Life as a King, 2009 for the Nintendo Wii Echoes of Time and My Life as a Dark Lord, and also the Crystal Bearers, 2019 for the Switch eShop Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Remastered, and was also on the PS4 store. Final Fantasy Dawn of Souls, released in 2004 in Japan as Final Fantasy 1 and 2 Advanced. It's a remastered compilation of the first 2 Final Fantasy games in the series. Final Fantasy XII was released in 2006 for the PlayStation 2. It introduced several innovations to the main series, like an open world, seamless battle system, controllable camera, and control of the AI players in battle. The game sold over 6 million copies worldwide and had a couple of ports and remasters, including 2017 for the PS4, 2019 for the Switch and Xbox One. Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings, released in 2006 on the Nintendo DS as a sequel to Final Fantasy XII. The North American release of the game was rebalanced to be more difficult than the original Japanese release, and that version was released in 2007. Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions is a tactical RPG for the PSP released in 2007. The game is an updated version of Final Fantasy Tactics for the PlayStation that was released in 1997. The game was developed to take advantage of the PSP screen ratio and multiplayer aspects. Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, released for the PSP in 2007 as a prequel to Final Fantasy VII. The game was originally planned to make a PSP port of the mobile game before Crisis Final Fantasy VII, but after discussion at Square they decided to make a whole new game instead. The game sold over 3 million copies worldwide. Final Fantasy Tactics A2 for the Nintendo DS, released in 2007. The game is a sequel to Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, Originally planned for the Game Boy Advance, the game began development in 2006. The game sold about 670,000 copies worldwide. Dissident of Final Fantasy is a fighting game with RPG elements developed for the PSP as part of the Final Fantasy 20th anniversary, released in 2008. Dissident originated from the Kingdom Hearts as a desire to create a spin-off for that franchise. Final Fantasy XIII was released for the PS3 and Xbox 360, released in Japan in 2009. Development on the game began in 2004 and was first announced at E3 2006. The game was first intended for the PS2, but the development team decided to move to the PS3 and use the new Crystal Tools engine created just for the 7th gen consoles. Final Fantasy XIV Online. The initial Windows release was in 2010, but was incomplete, and the fixes made the game change from the original version. Final Fantasy The Four Heroes of the Light for the Nintendo DS is a spin-off of the Final Fantasy series released in 2009. The game follows 4 kids who journey around their world to free their home from a terrible curse. A sequel for the game was cancelled, but never released. The 012 Final Fantasy is a fighting game published for the PSP and released in 2011 as part of the Final Fantasy series.
Are helpless but to do as bid, waging battle after endless battle for the gods who called them here, granted neither respite nor reprieve. Relying on what fragments of their shattered memories remain, they fight to end the conflict and for a chance to return home to the world's...
They chose their path.
Final Fantasy Type O was developed for the PlayStation Portable and was released in 2011. Gameplay is similar to Crisis Core in Final Fantasy VII and has a player taking control of characters in real-time combat. An HD remake called Final Fantasy Type O HD was released in 2015. Final Fantasy XIII-2 is a direct sequel to Final Fantasy XIII, released in 2011 for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Development began in 2010 and lasted about 1.5 years.
Divine Etro, go peaceful, lose all meaning under the rolling waves of chaos. Valhalla, the currents of time do not touch its shores.
Theater Rhythm Final Fantasy was released for the 3DS in 2012. It is a rhythm-based game that uses the touchscreen to various music selections from the Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn is an MMORPG released for PlayStation 3 and Windows in 2013. The game was a replacement for the 2010 version of Final Fantasy XIV, which was shut down after negative reception. The game received several add-ons and expansion packs, which include Heaven's Sword, Stormblood, and Shadowbringers. Final Fantasy XIII: Lightning Returns is an action RPG released in 2013 for the PS3 and Xbox 360. The game is a direct sequel to Final Fantasy 13-2 and concludes the Final Fantasy 13 storyline. Teridium Final Fantasy Curtain Call, a sequel to the 2012 game for the Nintendo 3DS. It follows the same pattern of using Final Fantasy music set to rhythm. It was released in 2014 in North America. Final Fantasy Explorers is an action RPG for the 3DS and was released in 2014. The game was designed around the main characters and was developed to be a spin-off into new mini-series of Final Fantasy. World of Final Fantasy was released for the PS4 and Vita in 2016. The game returns to more traditional gameplay style of earlier Final Fantasy titles. It revolves around turn-based battles and an enhanced edition called World of Final Fantasy Maxima was released in 2018 for the Nintendo Switch. The game was introduced to celebrate the series' 30th anniversary.
Good morning. I'm real sorry. I hope you haven't been waiting long.
Huh?
Right.
Fantasy 15, released for the PS4 and Xbox One in 2016. The game features an open-world environment and action-based battle system. The game shares a thematic connection with Final Fantasy 13 and Final Fantasy Type O. Development began in 2006 as a PS3 spin-off entitled Final Fantasy Versus 13. After 6 years of development, the director was replaced and the game shifted to the H-Gen consoles. As of November 2018, the game sold over 8.4 million copies. Final Fantasy mobile games include Final Fantasy Unlimited with You, Before Crisis Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VII Snowboarding, Dirge of Cerberus Lost Episode Final Fantasy VII, Crystal Defenders, Final Fantasy IV The After Years, Crystal Defenders Vanguard Storm, Final Fantasy Dimension, Final Fantasy Arcticans, Final Fantasy All the Bravest, Final Fantasy Tactics S, Final Fantasy Agato, Final Fantasy Record Keeper, Final Fantasy VII G-Bike, Final Fantasy Legends, Choki no Tsushio, Mobius Final Fantasy, Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, Final Fantasy Typo Online, Justice Monsters 5, Final Fantasy 15 A New Empire, and Dissa the Final Fantasy Omnia.